Hello and welcome to ReTech, and today we're going to talk about a video that Retro Recipes put out, Perifractic. And the reason for this is, it's not to knock it, it's basically to kind of agree with what he's saying, because I believe that he's going to open up a little bit of a can of worms with that video. What his proposition is, and his proposal is to actually bench a lot of these classic and vintage computers and then use the recreated ones, the emulated ones. And he does this with an example with the Maxi Amiga that he built based on the Amiga Mini. And it's quite a good premise. It's a very good way of actually getting a modern kind of perspective on a vintage machine. So you're not worried about them breaking down, you're not worried about them getting damaged so much, you're not worried about them failing, you're also not worried about them causing other issues such as random boot issues and then suddenly not working when you come to use it or turn it on. And I completely agree with where he's gone, because I actually did quite a big comment on his video. Kind of got a little bit out of hand because I wanted to say quite a lot, so I put a lot down there. It's quite a big comment, and I'm sure that's going to fire up some kind of backlash from the retro community as well, because I almost certainly agree with him and agree with his point. And I'll explain, because I don't agree with everything, which you can't do. I mean, it's that's what rational thought and own opinions and free speech is all about. And because of this, everybody has their own opinion, and there's nothing that anyone can say that isn't valid. Everyone has their own valid opinion on how to preserve, how to use, how to keep, how to store these classic and vintage machines. Now, you see a small selection here of machines, okay, starting from the silver Commodore VIC-20 down to the ZX Spectrum Plus, TI 99 4A, the ZX Spectrum Plus 128, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum original rubber key model, the Amiga 500, and there are others which I'm kind of running out of room, so I'll just put these on here for now. And what you may or may not realize is that these are all emulated, and I have a lot more. I've got BBC Micro and also the Atari ST, a couple of them, the range of the 520, 1040, etc. And that's not including the Retro Games Maxis, the Commodore 64 version and the VIC-20 version of their venerable clones or venerable remakes of vintage machines. Now, there are quite a few. You probably noticed I have quite a few in my collection, and I've built these up over the last maybe 18 months or so. And the reason for that is because I think the first one I did with the ZX Spectrum clone here, which was this one. I've done quite a few, so I can't remember. This was based upon the recreated ZX Spectrum, which was literally just a keyboard in a case, which was a Bluetooth system. So you'd Bluetooth it, use it via your mobile phone or your laptop or your PC, etc., and then play the games as if you were using a real ZX Spectrum. I mean, it looks identical. They did a really nice job on the case and the keyboard, but it was pretty lame. It wasn't really that good. So I converted this into a machine you could use using a Raspberry Pi and an emulator, and basically put it together, installed all of the software that I could ever need on it and all of the games that I ever wanted, and I've got a complete package. I can just plug into a HDMI TV and a little 5-volt power supply, and we're done. That is it. And as you can see, it's the recreated ZX Spectrum, okay? And it's a great little machine. I've used this a lot, an awful lot, and I've actually used this much more than my classic and vintage machine. Now, I think the second one in my list was a TI 99 4A, and the reason I built this is because it made a really good system for my little one to use. He loved using the vintage TI 99 4A, and he liked practicing BASIC on it and getting to grips with these sort of vintage micros. So I built this again original hardware, as in forms of the case, the keyboard, etc. That's completely original on this, and I've basically gutted a non-working machine. I've kept the boards, etc., so I can put it back together when I decide to repair the boards. But I have about 7 of these machines in total, including the beige American kind of very cost reduced one, which is actually one of my favorites, which you've probably seen in one of my earlier videos. But it's got every bit of software on that I could need and ever need. All the games, or just about every game that was produced for the TI-99 4A on that system. And it's just a plug and play, HDMI in again, and basically plug it into a little phone charger style power supply and you're ready to go. And there's no kind of risk of it being damaged or going pop because of worn out capacitors, etc. So it's a really good way of using a machine that looks like a classic machine, feels like a classic machine, runs like a classic machine, but is a modern recreation. Now, we come to something slightly different here. We have the ZX Spectrum Plus. It's a 48K Spectrum. It's an original case, original keyboard, but it's Harlequin based. It's a machine I built up from a Harlequin board. And it is a faithful recreation of a ZX Spectrum Plus, and it's very, very good. It's a very good machine, very reliable, runs. I haven't actually found any software that it doesn't run perfectly well, and it uses all of the modern peripherals, etc., that you use on the Spectrum at the time, such as joystick interfaces, SD adapters, MMC, hard drives, you name it, you can actually use on this machine as if it was an original Spectrum. So if you wanted to put an SD hard drive or an SD tape drive or an SD micro drive version on the back of this machine, it works perfectly, which is fantastic. And again, brand new membrane underneath it, rebuilt case, keyboard, the whole lot, works like a brand new machine. That's going to be around for a lot longer. And then that's the same with this 128K version, another Harlequin 128. Now the brilliant thing about this is it's already composite, same as that one. It's also very reliable, runs very cool, uses the standard peripherals for a ZX Spectrum, and it looks and feels and runs like a ZX Spectrum. It's in a Spanish 128K case as well, which is great. And the only thing that's missing is the heatsink, because it's not needed. This machine doesn't need that big chunk of metal on the side to keep it cool. Now the advantage of this machine is that it runs 48K and 128K systems very well. Without a hitch, you wouldn't know any different, but it's also got a lot of other systems in this. It can actually be used as a Jupiter Ace among many other systems, and it's also got the original 9 tiles ROMs on board as well, so you could actually play around with the original ROM set for the Sinclair machines, and that is a great piece of history. And I contacted Mr. Grant about this because he actually doesn't live far away from here, and I asked him about the ROMs on this and said, do you realize that they're being cloned? And he was all right with it. He said it was fine as long as it wasn't for commercial use, and he's quite happy for them to be used. So I have a 9 tiles ROM set on this, which was the development platform for the Sinclair machines and the ZX Spectrum. So this machine can be used for a lot of other things, but it's a fantastic 128 and Spectrum Plus clone. So then we come on to this. It is a Commodore 64 I built. The case was an old VIC-20 case which was ruined, and it was just a case. The keyboard is quite nice, so I thought I'd use it, and it's built around a Raspberry Pi. It can be used as a Plus 4, a 64, a VIC-20 and a Commodore PET. And again, it's got every single game and productivity software you could ever want already pre-installed on this machine. And this machine actually gets used an awful lot, because this was before the time of the Maxi. I built this before the Maxi came out, and I actually did a video about the comparison between the two. But it's a nice system. I quite like it. It doesn't use any of the mini hardware inside of it. It is literally a bespoke system using a Pi, and it works really well. And yes, this isn't original. It's not meant to be an original. It's not even meant to look like an original machine, which is why I purposely did it in this silver color to make it stand out from all of the other Commodore units I've got, because I think I've got about 15 other Commodore units which I've completely restored. Well, I have now, as it was quite rightly said in Retro Recipes Perifractics video, okay, is that there is a shortage of components. Components for these machines are getting very hard to obtain now. You see, when I rebuilt a couple of my Plus 4s, I actually got recreated processors, not the hack junk version where it swaps a few pins on the Commodore 64 CPU to make it work in the Plus 4. I'm talking about a complete recreation of the processor in a modern package with modern temperatures, modern cooling on it, etc. And it works really, really well. And it was a gentleman from Italy who was producing these at the time. And if you want to see more details on it, have a quick look at my Plus 4 recreation or Plus 4 repair videos, and it'll show you all of that through that. And it was a fantastic recreation of the processor that was used on the Plus 4. And then, you know, getting hold of a ROM set for another Plus 4 was a hard job, because one of my Plus 4s, the Plus 4 ROM set had died. It was completely dead. Now, the only option I had was to clone it. But I managed to get hold of a much better set, again, from Italy. I think it might have been from the same guy. I'm almost certain it was. And it was a very good recreation. And I actually got a lot of other components from all around Europe to make these machines work. And the last 64 I did had an issue with its SID chip, and what it was doing is it was kind of playing but erratically, and you could tell the processor was, or the chip was breaking down. And you know, you kind of left with a Swin SID and all this kind of thing just to get it to working. I couldn't really get a decent original one, so I got an ARM SID. And now ARM SIDs are very hard to find. They are a bit thin on the ground compared to where they were a year ago. And it's the same for all of the other cloned, recreated systems and parts for these machines. They're getting very hard. He's completely on the money in that respect. And it's the same as the Amiga. This is my Amiga Maxi 500. It's not based on the A500 Mini. It's based on, again, a Pi and an original case and keyboard, or a case and keyboard that I actually rescued from a completely dead machine. So this is kind of recycling parts, which is a good thing. And it looks and it feels and it runs like a stock Amiga. It goes straight into Workbench and you can run everything from there. It's not like the Carousel edition on the A500 Mini. And this was a year ago or more now that this machine was built. So that's why I was a little bit scathing about the A500 Mini, because they could have done better, so much better, and had it so much better out of the box with just a little bit of time and effort. But the retro games, larger models such as the Maxi version of the 64 and the VIC-20 are very good. I really have nothing but good things to say about them. And in fact, I got one for my son. It must have been 18, 2 years, coming up for 2 years ago. Yeah, it must have been nearly 2 years ago now. And he's used it constantly and consistently, and he's learnt to program on it because it acts and reacts like an almost standard machine, which is great, which is what I hoped the A500 Mini would have been more like. But the biggest point is that all of these recreations, all of these will last a long time, a lot longer than the original machines. Now I have an original VIC-20 here. I've also got a VC-20, 64G, 64C, 64 Aldi, standard bread bin 64s. I got basically just about every model of the 64 that was out there. But they've all needed work. They have all needed work at some point or other. And do you know the biggest reason why, which is something I put on my comments, okay, about the video that Retro Recipes Perifractic did, was the fact that all of the components in any electronic piece of equipment have a lifespan. And the biggest issue now we have is that all the components that were used in all of these vintage and classic machines are well past their safe use by date. For example, power supply of a Dragon 32, okay? This is the drop down board, basically drops everything down to the relevant 5 volts on the Dragon 32. Now, these capacitors, okay, they look in really good condition and they are visually in very good condition. The resistors, the switch, the components, the RF modulator, the actual board itself looks like it's in very good condition, but it's not. This board has failed, and it's failed on things you cannot see unless you test them. And the biggest failure on this is the regulators. Okay, so it's quite an easy fix, but because the regulators have been failing, it's been chucking out the wrong voltage, basically passing through even a small amount of voltage over what it can really handle is going to start damaging components and shortening their life. Well, these components don't have any lifespan left really and truly in them. They are 30 years over their recommended lifespan. Most of these components had a 10-year maximum lifespan, and it gets even worse because when you look at boards such as the Sinclair ZX Spectrum board, the Dragon 32, the Auric 1, basically including the Commodore, definitely the Commodore 64, the Plus 4, the 128, the Amigas, the Atari STs, etc. They were built around the cheapest and the most cost-effective components that the companies could find. So in the case of the ZX Spectrum, they used repurposed memory chips. They'd failed their test. They were no longer, say, 64K memory chips. They were actually repurposed to make them 48K and so on. That happened on the Auric 1, the Dragon 32. It happened on nearly all of the micros that were out there, with very few exceptions, and one of those was the BBC Micro. It used very few repurposed components, but the sheer number of components that were on that board means that they are going to fail. They are ready to fail. So if we take a look at this BBC board here, we have a Model B board with hundreds plus components on this board. Each one of them has roughly a 10-year lifespan. Now this is 31 years outside of its lifespan. So how much longer are these going to last? How much longer are the basic components going to last before they start failing? Well, out of experience, not a lot longer. And because out of all of the BBC machines, I think I've had 7, I have 3 fully functioning machines. The others are in a state of disrepair because they need a lot of work to make them functional again. I will do it eventually, but it will be a case of replacing just about every replaceable component that I can get hold of to make them work, and that's time consuming and can be relatively expensive. And then there's no guarantee that these ICs won't fail at any time in the future. all of the original ICs. Now, the reason why these ICs are going to fail is because, again, they are way outside of their operational life. You see, the way these ICs function, you are basically getting problems with electrons that run around these components every time they're on. And you also get stray electrons which then miss and embed themselves in the actual silicon of these chips. And eventually they embed themselves to such a point that these start failing. These will fail. And they will fail sooner than later because of the age of these machines. Now, I have a collection of ICs, but none of them are being reproduced now, or very few of them. So it makes it harder to keep these machines running for longer. So you're always on a knife edge when you're replacing ICs out of another machine because they're roughly the same age. And these do fail, these do degrade in the same way floppy disks, hard drives, they get bit rot. They also get affected by radiation that you take for granted, normal atmospheric radiation, and eventually they fail. You see, none of these are hardened against stray radiation. None of these are hardened against any of that, where machines and computers on space stations and the shuttle when it was flying and so on are hardened against it. And there's a case where there's a result, and I'll dig this one out because it's quite interesting, and I might do a bit of a video on this, where the results of a vote, I believe, were flipped because radiation affected one of these ICs, or one of the ICs in the machines, and it flipped a 1 to a 0. And that happens, and it happens more than you think on machines that are actually more prone to being hit by stray radiation. These will fail. These chips will eventually fail. How long into the future, we don't know. Now, there's two schools of thought on how to make these machines live longer. One of them is this. It's great. Recreate them, redo them, make them look the same, make them act the same, make them be much more reliable, and use them for another 30 years. This is this lot. But will they be able to be used for 30 years in the same way we've been able to use these machines for the last 30 years? You see, I have a Tapco 24-bit sound system here. Okay, it's for both microphones, mixing, and basically for sending your music or whatever you're doing on it back to a desktop PC or a laptop. And it's very good. It's a very, very nice piece of kit. It works well, or shall I say it worked well. This isn't very old, and it has failed. It's failed at a very relatively young age. Now, that's fine. We do understand that these things will go wrong. I will open it up one day and have a look at it and try and find out what's going on with it, and then try and repair it. But just a point in case, it's a few years old. It's not decades and decades old. And that's the same for every piece of electronic equipment that's out there. They will fail at some point. Now, Bill Hurd famously said he often wondered how these machines were so reliable. How, after all this time, when he'd expected them after 10 years to be all consigned to the dustbin or the trash can or the recycling bin or landfill, because that was his expectation on the lifetime, on the life cycle of these vintage machines. And he often wondered how they were still working, until he realized that enthusiasts keep them running by cannibalizing other machines to keep them working. So let's say this VIC-20 is getting on a bit. It's over 40 years old. And in that time, this VIC-20 could have had parts from 3, 4 or 5 different machines to keep this one running. And that's almost certainly the same for the Plus 4. The Plus 4, out of all the Plus 4s I've had, they've all been faulty. They've all been faulty or started off working and then gone faulty within such a short space of time and had to be repaired. And that's by using used components, recycled components, or where possible recreated components. But that's not always possible. So that's how these machines keep going. It's the enthusiasts that keep them going. Now the schools of thought are, if you use them and you keep them on and running, they will suffer less corrosion because there's always heat being generated through the board, which is kind of true, because then there's very little chance of corrosion building up due to inactivity, condensation, temperature changes, etc. But there's also a thought, which is where perifractic's coming from, is if he keeps them on the shelf and he turns them on now and again to use them, they're going to last a lot longer because they're not being used as much. And again, it's also a valid thought. But when you take a component like these capacitors, which are in a state of charge and discharge, that's basically what they're doing. They're smoothing out the current, smoothing out the power that's going beyond that point through to the board. So they're actually acting like a little bit like a rechargeable battery, but very, very quickly, very fast. They hold a charge. So they actually are being used. They are being constantly regenerated while the machine's being used. Now, when the machine is off and it's then powered back on, especially after a long period of inactivity, there is that sudden surge of power going through the system, and that tends to be when things start to fail. Most people who collect these things, these vintage machines or vintage electronics, will tell you that most of the time they fail on a power on. They'll be working the night before, the day before, or the week before, then you switch it on and then it suddenly lets go. One of the capacitors lets go, or something lets go within the machine. And again, it's that initial power on that can potentially cause damage to the machines. Now, but that's not to say leaving the machines on running is going to not cause damage to the machines, because it is. It's going to start wearing components out. You see, CPUs become slower with age. It's a fact. They will slow down with age, and they will start having errors creeping into them because of stray electrons, etc. So you're kind of in a bit of a rock and a hard place. It's whether you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't in this case. And then there's memory. Memory physically wears out. It actually wears out. There's been studies into things like USB keys and memory chips and so on, and it's been proven that memory actually gets heavier as it becomes full. So memory actually does change in weight. We would never know. You're talking very, very minute changes, but it's there and it happens, which means that it's changing in weight, atomic weight more than likely. It's also changing in heat. It's actually having heat through it, which again causes wear and tear to the chip itself. So then we're back to square one. Should I use them or shouldn't I? Well, me personally, I've got them, so I'm going to use them. If they go wrong, I will fix them. If I can't fix them, then it becomes a museum piece, and that's it. That's the end of it. This will literally, as I wrote in my piece, my little comment or long comment, is that it will become the equivalent of an aircraft in an aircraft museum. It will look like a computer in the same way that the aircraft in the aircraft museum looks like an aircraft, but that aircraft will never touch the clouds again. these machines will never run anything again once they get to that point. And that's what I think we are all going to have to accept at some point. We've been on a bit of a tipping point, really, I'd say for the last maybe 15 years as to whether these machines are going to last a lot longer. And they have. For, not the majority of them, but for a big portion of these machines. And they've actually outlasted and outlived their initial estimates on their lifespan, which is a good thing. So what I would like to say is that, whichever route you go down, there's no right and wrong route on these machines. You can preserve them, you can put them in vacuum bags, you can put them in a secure location, they never come out again, but then when you do switch them on, they fail. That's the chance you're going to have to take. Or you can use them, have fun with them, play with them. If you're new to this, find out what this was all about back in the day. Get a feel for it before you can no longer do it. Before they are consigned to being static museum pieces, and before they're consigned to a distant memory in the same way as some of the machines of the past are now, such as the Manchester Baby, the ENIAC, and so on. They've all kind of disappeared into the past. There are references for them, there are books about them, but can you go and touch them, play with them, use them? You can't. So while you've got the chance, use them, play with them, get to know the product, get to know their shortcomings, and then when it passes over, you will at least have had a chance to experience these machines as how they were before emulation was the only way forward. So yeah, that's my take on the original and the recreated machines. I'm in both camps, which is why I've done both. So I hope you found this interesting, or maybe it was a bit long. I think it was probably a bit long, but I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it gives you some ideas about recreating these machines. One little caveat though is that it's no longer financially viable to recreate a lot of these machines now, because of the price of all of the components have skyrocketed. The price of original machines, faulty ones, are skyrocketing, and also the cost of what you have to put inside of them. Even Raspberry Pis have skyrocketed in cost when you compare it to where it was 2 years ago. So it's not a cheap way of recreating them, but it's a way of adding longevity to the platform, or to the look and feel of the platform, which is probably the most and the best way of explaining it. So yeah, it was a great video that Perifractic did. It was very thought-provoking, and you can probably see I've thought about it for a little while since I watched it. And there is no right and wrong. There is no right and wrong way of preserving these. And you have to remember that a lot of museums will not recap machines wholesale, because a museum, especially in the UK, has to be able to prove its authenticity, its originality. And from that end, recapping these wholesale takes away that originality from a museum standpoint. So, we're kind of at a bit of a crossroads. But my advice is, if you got one, use it. Use it until it breaks. Get some fun out of it and enjoy it. So thanks for watching. I hope you'll join me on my next video, and thank you for your time. Please subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.